Hello, I'm Sachi Yanari Rizzo, Curator of Prints and Drawings here at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Every other month, I present a talk in the Print and Drawing Study Center and offer it virtually. For this season of Print Room Talks, we will go back to the basics of printmaking. Oftentimes, people feel that there is so much jargon related to printmaking techniques and materials. In this series, we will explore various printmaking processes together and hopefully nurture a love of prints. We should begin with what is a print? In essence, a print is made by transferring an image from one surface to another using ink, and it is possible to make multiple copies. Printmaking processes can be divided into 4 different categories, or I like to think of them as families, based on how they are made. They include relief, intaglio, planographic, and stencil. In general, to make a print, the artist creates a design on the surface of what we will call a matrix. The matrix is something sometimes referred to as a block, stone, or a plate. How the artist creates the image on the matrix will differ from process to process. After creating the design on the matrix, the artist applies ink, and with the use of pressure, it is transferred onto a support, usually paper. The original work of art is the print, not the matrix from which it is printed. The process is capable of printing multiple impressions, all from the same matrix. This repeatable quality distinguishes prints from drawings and paintings, which are unique. Many contemporary artists will limit the number of impressions of a work. This is a woodcut by Robert Bozeman entitled Bad Kitty. In the lower left margin, the artist has written a fraction in pencil. The term addition is the total number of prints pulled from the matrix. The bottom number of the fraction will indicate the total number of impressions that were printed. The top number indicates what number it is in the addition. After the printing is complete, an artist may cancel the plate by making lines across the image. The lines would indicate that subsequent prints were not part of the original edition. The number of quality impressions made from the matrix may be limited by the process and the materials used. Basically, the matrix may begin to break down after repeated printings through a press. Today, we will look at relief, the oldest method of printing. Various materials can be used for the matrix. In the case of relief, it is usually called a block. The block can be made of wood, linoleum, or probably one of the most familiar examples is a rubber stamp. It does not require extensive materials, just some ink, the block, and some tools for cutting and rolling on the ink. Regardless of the material used for the block, in all these cases, the material of the block is removed or carved away, leaving the image standing tall or in relief, hence the name. Only this raised surface will be printed. On the left, Fort Wayne artist Art Sislo uses a gouge to remove some of the wood. After the design is carved, a fairly thick printer's ink is applied. Prior to the 19th century, the artist used a dabber. In the center image, Sislo rolls ink across the surface of the block with a brayer. The ink is too stiff to bleed into the recessed areas, which will be the white of the paper. Transferring the image from the block to the paper can be accomplished by running it through a printing press or done manually. To print by hand, the artist can use the block like a stamp, or the paper is laid on top of the block and the artist can use the back of the wooden spoon, exerting vertical pressure to transfer the ink from the block to the paper. We will first look at using a wood plank for woodcuts. There are 2 ways that we can cut a piece of wood. For a woodcut, we are sawing lengthwise so that the grain runs along the surface of the block. The block is usually a 1-inch plank from a softwood, such as pine, cedar, or poplar, and planed down until it is smooth. Also, the wood must be seasoned so it will not warp or crack. We can date printing from a wood block back to the 9th century in China. These ideas moved westward to Europe through trade, appearing around the 13th century in the West, first emerging as stamp designs onto textiles. Prints on paper appear in the second half of the 14th century. This development was dependent on the innovations of printmaking and its availability as an inexpensive product. The earliest woodcuts were religious images to sell to pilgrims. The biggest boon for woodcut came in the form of the illustrated book. The invention of the printing press and movable type transformed printmaking. Movable type technology was pioneered in 11th century China. This refers to individual blocks with a single character that could be assembled to print a page and then reassembled for a subsequent printing. Previously, text was made on a single big block. It was expensive and time-consuming to make. One mistake could jeopardize the block. Chinese innovator Bi Sheng made a system of movable type by carving individual Chinese characters in baked clay during the Song dynasty. Movable type made from cast metal appeared in 13th century Korea. By the mid-1400s, through contact between Asia and Europe, printing techniques disseminated. By the mid-1400s, Johann Gutenberg of Germany created a mechanical printing press that allowed for the mass production of books, pamphlets, and posters. Gutenberg's Bible is considered one of the first mass-produced books in Western Europe. The press was quick and consistent in printing. Previously, written texts were painstakingly and slowly copied by hand. Since the printing of movable type is a relief process, and so is the woodcut, the two became married as the perfect way to illustrate a book. The wood blocks alongside the movable type, all the same height, could be placed on the press and printed at once. While most of our collection consists of works from the late 19th century to the present, we also have two woodcuts by German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer, who was working not long after Gutenberg's inventions. Dürer has had probably the most lasting influence on the history of printmaking. Medieval woodcuts prior to Dürer tended to have thick outlines and were colored by hand or with stencils. Delicate lines were difficult to carve, and if too thin, could break down under the pressure. Dürer was a pioneer in his use of narrative, an innovative approach to subject matter, naturalistic body proportions, perspective, and incomparable carving ability in woodcut. Although a painter as well, Dürer created more than 250 graphic works between woodcut and intaglio and elevated woodcut's stature. Here is a detail of our two prints that show off Dürer's sensitive line, whether it was for outlines or to depict three-dimensional form. By carving a series of thin lines close together, Dürer could convincingly depict shadows and create a sense of volume. To give you a sense of scale and the fineness of his hatchings, the print's dimensions are about 5 by 4 inches. The term letterpress is used for book printing done on a relief press. Letterpress printing became obsolete by the 1960s and 70s, being replaced by offset printing. The presses could be purchased relatively inexpensively. Today, artists have opened letterpress studios all over. In Fort Wayne, for example, we have the Hedge and Hartel Press. Ashton Ludden, seen here, is an artist and educator utilizing letterpress and relief prints. Rather than using text for a book, Ludden creates brief, bold messages to punctuate her work that focus on our relationship between nature and wildlife. In the close-up on the right, note the meticulous details in the mounted deer heads. This contrasts with the simplicity of the typeface used in her idiom, which is a play on words with the words bang and buck. The museum is fortunate to own both the woodblock and final print of St. John the Baptist by Art Sislow. He has used a harder cherry wood in this case. While softwood is easier to carve, it may not hold up as well in repeated printing if using a press. Also, softwood is not as conducive to creating fine details. Various size gouges, knives, and chisels are typically used to cut away the material in making a woodcut. An artist might select a block due to some imperfections, like a knot. In this case, Sislow has incorporated the grain of the wood into the image. The artist can use a wire brush to help bring out the grain in the block. And through this rubbing, softer parts of the wood are removed, and what remains is the harder part that is slightly raised. And you'll notice that the entire block is in very low relief. And also note that the image in the final print is in reverse of the carved block. In the case of Susan Rothenberg, she carved on parquet flooring that was made up of smaller hardwood put together to make geometric patterns. She uses a parquet grid of textured squares to create an interesting background pattern. The dimensions of the finished print may be limited by the size of the block from the tree trunk or the dimensions of the printing press bed. Several smaller blocks can be fastened together to make a larger block, and relief printing can be done by hand, as seen here in the still from a video showing the hand printing of one of John Buck's monumental woodcuts. On the right is a woodcut by Buck in our collection entitled Great Falls. It is made up of two sheets that form a T shape and measures 83 by 66 inches. In these woodcuts by Eric Heckel and Karsten Kreitny, both artists have exploited the spontaneous nature of carving wood, leading to a greater expressiveness. Heckel and other German expressionist artists working in the early 20th century were interested in revealing emotion and inner psychological states. They looked to the Germanic tradition in printmaking, and woodcut in particular became a favorite medium. The use of exaggeration and distortion of forms was common. Kreitny is drawn to the works of the German expressionists. The cuts in his Lamenting Man result in an angularity that contribute to a sense of sorrow. In contrast to the bold, simple forms of Heckel and Kreitny, Via Salmons's ocean surface is a mesmerizing array of abstract marks when you view it up closely. From a distance, it coalesces into ripples and waves that fill the entire field, void of a horizon line. Salmon commented, "The ocean woodcut was difficult because it was so hard to find your place in it. And also, if you made too big of a cut, it's a goner." Marwan Begay presents precisely carved lines in the feathers of the cedar waxwing and the ornate pattern in the background that seems to be reminiscent of textiles. The artist acknowledges the inspiration of his grandmother, who was a weaver. Begay explained, "I have partnered the background design with the birds' sense of place. As these patterns have increased in their complexity and drafted towards abstractions, so has my experimentation in the relief process. I have tried to defy the static design presentation by creating flux through the lines, evoking the movement of air, thinking of the birds." The next relief printing process we'll look at is wood engraving. We return to our image of the log. Wood engraving blocks are cut in the opposite direction to get the end or cross grain. British illustrator and naturalist Thomas Bewick perfected and promoted the use of the wood engraving in 1768. Typically, hardwoods are used, such as boxwood, lemonwood, or cherry. The end grain of a hardwood is dense, and printmakers can use traditional copper engraving tools like burins to cut across the grain. The burin marks can be finer and more precise than a knife or gouge used in a woodcut. Frederick Remington, Thomas Nast, and Winslow Homer were all artists who contributed drawings to illustrated newspapers. Newspapers and magazines like Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspapers gave a high priority to images. Because thousands of impressions could be printed from an engraved woodblock, the process was perfect for commercial printing. It would take an inordinate amount of time for a single carver at the newspaper to reproduce a drawing, so it wasn't uncommon for the task to be divided in order to meet strict deadlines. 10 to 15 carvers might work on a single image whose block was cut into smaller squares that screwed together. The various carvers were responsible for just their square, but together made a composite block. Leonard Baskin was a sculptor and printmaker, notably known for his life-size woodcuts and book illustrations. He appreciated the immediacy in printmaking over painting. The museum owns 2 prints by Baskin, and both are wood engravings. We can see the degree of fine detail he was able to achieve in the bristle-like tops of the thistle plant, set against the delicate features of the full moon. Linoleum is another material used in relief printing. The prints are either called linoleum block printing or shortened to lino cuts. Linoleum is made of burlap coated with linseed oil, powdered cork, and rosin. It is mostly recognized as an inexpensive flooring material. Linoleum was invented by Frederick Walton in 1860 and was the most popular flooring material between 1870 and the 1960s. Will H. Bradley and Bruce Porter began using linoleum as an artistic medium in the mid-1890s. By the 1920s, books extolled the value of linoleum. Linoleum is a soft, pliable material that is easy to cut. However, it can crumble, so it is difficult to create fine lines. The surface is smooth, and if anything, may leave a grainy texture. While our association with linoleum is with the flooring material, today artists can use linoleum made specifically for art. The tools used for linoleum are like gouges for woodcut. We have a close-up of Karsten Kreitny's Gambler, so you can compare the type of marks that he made against the gouge samples on the right. Kreitny is able to capture the gentle curve of the man's ankle and foot. Linoleum doesn't have a directional grain, so it is easy to cut in any direction. There is no splintering or chipping, which you could experience with wood. Lino cuts are ideal for producing thick areas of ink, not unlike that achieved in silkscreen. In Dennis McNett's portrait of Kenny, you contrast the smooth, flat black in the background against the highly detailed sculptural face of his sitter. These are 3 lino cuts from Elizabeth Catlett's I Am the Black Woman series that she created in Mexico in 1947. She worked with a printmaking collective committed to creating a social political art that would educate and engage the Mexican people. Lino cuts were an ideal medium since they were inexpensive to make and could be printed in mass quantities to reach a broad audience. For I Am the Black Woman, Catlett borrowed the format of one of their epic series presenting the history of the Mexican Revolution. Catlett's series became a historical story of the struggles of African Americans told through the experiences of women. As I mentioned earlier, the most familiar form of relief print is likely the rubber stamp, although an unlikely medium in fine art printing. However, unsurprisingly, Andy Warhol's hand-stamped the S&H green stamp in a 1962 painting now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Stamping allowed him to explore repetition and reproducible imagery. There was also a rubber stamp portfolio. In 1976, Parasol Press made a portfolio of 13 rubber stamp prints by artists including Carl Andre, Chuck Close, Tom Wesselman, among others. In Parasol Press's desire to be able to offer fine art prints that would be a fraction of the price, the rubber stamp came up as the cheapest method. The portfolio retailed for $100 and in an edition of 1,000. In the Fort Wayne Museum of Art's collection, John Newman stamped repeatedly and propagating purple. The 3-dimensional twisting grid pattern is the lino cut, and the tumbling smaller forms are printed from a rubber stamp based on one of his drawings. I am adding the collograph process to the relief group. It doesn't fall neatly into a category, but the printing surface is built up. The term collograph originates from the Greek word kala, meaning glue, and graphos, meaning to write. Rather than cutting away material, flat objects are glued or affixed to the surface of the matrix. The collaged elements will be raised, but not in excess of maybe about 1/4 of an inch in height. Otherwise, you will risk tearing the paper when printing. After collage work is finished, the matrix is coated with a medium. Ink is rolled on and the paper placed on top. It can be made with or without a printing press. This is a work in the collection by Megan O'Connor, who enjoys combining traditional printmaking with experimentation in textures and effects. In Hometown Hierarchy, she uses collograph with lithography. I found a process photo showing how she has positioned feathers along the top of the composition with different types of birds and owls. The collograph impressions will appear to have textures corresponding with the collaged items. In this detail of the upper right corner, you notice that the feathers faintly appear in the background. It creates an interesting subtle pattern while relating to the subject at the same time. Now that we understand some of the basic relief printing process, the question is, how do artists add color? Art Sislo used the watercolor and manually hand-colored Song of Songs, The Beloved. In the detail on the right, notice the delicate blending of the pigments, subtle tonal and color saturation variations that are possible when it is hand-painted. This handwork allows for more individual differences between impressions. Crichton adds color to Lamenting Man by carving additional wood blocks, one for each color, and printing them sequentially. When printing multiple blocks, care must be taken in proper placement and alignment, which is known as registration. Crichton likely applied a wire brush to the block to bring out the tight wood grain. The blocks of yellow and blue inks pulled out the fine grain pattern and allow glimpses of the white paper to show through. Traditional color printing in Japan was distinct from the West. Japanese woodblock prints were created through the division and skilled labor between the artist creating the design, the carver, the printer, and finally the publisher. Instead of using oil-based ink and printing presses, Japanese artisans used water-based inks and hand-printed. We can sense some of the differences in this comparison between prints by Utagawa Kuniyoshi on the left and Vincent Smith on the right. Smith's woodcut was printed with a thick oil-based ink. Ink was rolled on with a brayer, which provided an even, smooth application of ink. In Kuniyoshi's print, the master printer mixed and used brushes to apply the water-based ink mixed with paste. The tonal gradations in the blue lake in the background is a technique called bokashi. The printer also used disc-shaped handheld barons to print. The handmade paper is made from a kozo fiber, the inner bark of a mulberry. Francesco Clemente's self-portrait, simply entitled I, is more reminiscent of a watercolor than a woodcut, with its fluidity, bleeding, and high-key color. Crown Point Press was able to adopt the Japanese ukiyo-e method of woodblock printing beginning in 1982. Clemente was among a dozen artists who made 2-week trips to work with Tadashi Toda in Kyoto. Images were sent ahead of time to have the master carvers work on the woodblocks. Another way to accomplish color printing is through a reductive process. These are examples of reduction prints in which the artist used a single block to print all the layers of the print rather than using a different block for each color. To begin, the artist cuts away any area that will remain the color of the paper and prints the lightest color on every sheet in the edition. Using the same block, the artist then cuts away more areas to remain that color, just printed, and then prints the next darkest color on all those sheets. The process keeps repeating, printing from light to dark and developing the image along the way. By the time the last color is printed, there is very little that remains of the block. The number of the prints in the edition has to be determined first thing, and subsequent editions cannot be printed since the block only retains the carving from the last layer. Art Sislo and Michelle Martin's works display a range of effects possible using this technique. Sislo's use of colors and forms are bold, whereas Martin utilizes numerous layers of color with fine hatching. Pablo Picasso was a master of making reduction linocuts later in life when he was living in southern France in Valois. The local printer suggested he use linoleum, and I've included a link to a video produced by the British Museum that goes through the process print by print. Karsten Crichton's The Gambler is a reduction linocut. The artist removes small amounts of linoleum, printing in blue ink first, and leaving the white of the paper in the clouds, shirt, and dice. This was followed by an additional carving on the same block for overprinting using the opaque gray ink. Black is left for the end, including all the small gouges to form the grass. When the black ink overprints, the gray texture pattern emerges. Carol Summers had innovative ideas about printing and adding color. It wasn't uncommon for him to print on both sides of the sheet. He might place the paper over the uninked wood block and roll ink directly onto the paper as seen on the right. This technique gives the artist much control over the amount of ink applied. Summers departed even further from traditional approaches by spraying his color prints with mineral spirits that would thin the ink. Summers liked using a porous Japanese paper, which would draw down the ink from the surface. The effect of this technique is apparent in the diffuse, softened areas of colors in the abstract mountain form in Macha Pukari, probably named for the mountain in the Himalayas. I wanted to end with a couple of interesting examples of relief printing. In woodcut, we've learned that the printmaker typically uses a gouge and knife to make cuts into the woodblock. In her woodcut vest, Marie Watt creates this beautiful abstraction using tiny markings made with a tool called a roulette. The small flecks resemble a running stitch, recalling Watt's expressive hand sewing on her blankets used in her monumental sculptural work. She only used 2 colors in vest, red and a transparent black, but the overlaid inks blend to create additional colors. There is a photo of roulettes on the right, all with a small revolving textured wheel attached to a handle. The tool is used in intaglio processes more than woodcut. The roulettes can have a dot, irregular, or line patterns. The roulette is rolled on the block or plate to create tonal areas. Watt uses Shina plywood, a favorite amongst Japanese printmakers. Shina is almost grainless and can be carved easily, so probably that's why the roulette works so well for her, but dense enough to hold sharp edges and details through many printings. Finally, the museum owns a series of woodcuts by South Bend artist Ramiro Rodriguez. On the right is his installation for Dia de los Muertos, honoring the lives of deceased members of his family. It was a multimedia piece, including an ofrenda, video, and prints from the Earth Dragon suite that were pulled from all sides of the hand-carved coffin. The long side of the coffin facing us shows the carved block used for Fiesta, our print on the left. Rodriguez explained, when viewed in sections, the sides of the box present a snapshot of various aspects of life. However, when viewed as a succession of prints pulled from the individual side sections, a life's journey is exposed as a continuous circular image that repeats infinitely as the body of an Olmec dragon carved into a stone sarcophagus. A version of the installation was presented at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art in 2013, and subsequently his woodcuts were purchased. Thank you for joining me today. On Wednesday, November 16th at 2 p.m., we will begin exploring different intaglio techniques, including engraving, dry point, and mezzotint.